Hi everyone, thank you for coming out tonight. I'm Elena, and I just wanted to tell you about a few of our upcoming programs before we get started. So the next program we have coming up is a week from tonight, just in time for Patriots Day. Next Tuesday at 6 p.m. we have the Patriot Fife and Drum Duo coming, and they do perform fully costumed. We're very excited about that. And then we have a new program starting next Wednesday. It is from 12 to 1. It is Yoga by Donation is coming in, and they are doing chair yoga. So she does not turn anybody away. It's whatever you can pay her. So she has a suggested donation of $10. And we do have a sign-up sheet over on our circulation desk so we can plan for how many chairs we need to put out. And then we also have coming up next Saturday, which is April 21st at 11 a.m., the Center for Wildlife will be joining us. That's always a very popular presentation. And they're going to be doing raptors, reptiles, and mammals. These are free presentations that we do here, so anybody is welcome to stop by. And we do have a full schedule lined up for April vacation. We do have our newsletter available, which is right here on this snack table, so please definitely grab one of these before you leave tonight and grab some snacks. And this has everything listed for the month of April. We also have these always by our circulation desk, so when you come in next time, you can grab the next month's and so on. So tonight, we are very excited to have Mac Smith here with us to talk about his book, Mainers on the Titanic. Mac is a Navy veteran of the First Gulf War and a former news reporter for the Bar Harbor Times. And he lives in Stockton Springs, Maine, which I just asked him. He said was 3 hours away, and I cannot believe that. And he is currently living there restoring his family homestead. So this is his first book, and please welcome him up to talk about Mainers on the Titanic.
Well, thank you for being here, everybody. My name is Mac Smith. I'm here from Stockton Springs, about 3 hours away on the banks of the Penobscot River. My first book, Mainers on the Titanic, has been published by Down East Books, the same good folks who published Down East Magazine. Tonight is a very special night. It was 106 years ago today that Titanic actually set sail from Southampton, England on her fateful voyage. And my book is basically broken into three sections. The very first starts on the morning of April 15th, the day Titanic had sunk about 2 a.m. Monday morning on the 15th. And this starts the morning of the 15th here in Maine. And it begins, "A lurking fear remained of possible bad tidings to come." And that was from the Bangor Daily Commercial. And basically when Mainers woke up a few hours after Titanic sank, because of the Marconi wireless, which was a new invention, news had already gotten to the United States, and Mainers woke up to the headlines from the Lewiston Daily Sun. Titanic strikes iceberg, assistance is asked for. The Lewiston Evening Journal said all passengers on Titanic saved. And the Portland Evening Express said Titanic's passengers are all safe, steamship being towed to Halifax. The reason for this misinformation was that the White Star Line, who owned Titanic, they knew of the great loss of life, but they sort of put the information out slowly. They hoped beyond hope that the information was incorrect, but it was not. But Mainers spent Monday just thinking that a great thrilling thing had happened in the North Atlantic and there would be good stories coming from it, but there was certainly no loss of life. On that day, on Monday, J.P. Morgan Jr., who owned White Star Line, made some calls, and the Maine Central Railroad and the Boston and Maine Railroad became involved in a train that left New York City, and it came through Portland. It was going to go to Halifax to pick up the passengers and then return them to New York, and it was going to stop in Portland on the way back. So Mainers knew that they were going to have a front row seat to hear the stories from these passengers. What they didn't know was that Mr. Morgan had arranged for trains to accommodate 1,400 people. The complement on Titanic was over 2,200 people. So he knew that they did not need trains for all the people aboard because there had been that loss of life. That train rolled into the train station in Portland, and by then it had been decided to bring all the survivors to New York instead of Halifax. And about an hour after the train turned around, the White Star Line announced that Titanic had in fact sunk, and an hour after that they announced that there was believed to be a great loss of life. And I'm just briefly going to summarize that first section of what was going on here in Maine when Titanic sank. We were instrumental in the dissemination of the list of third-class passengers. Our state's newspapers ran many editorials on the subject. They did editorial cartoons, but there was one illustration. It's the Titanic superimposed on a map of downtown Portland to give it an idea of the enormity, the size of the ship. Newspapers interviewed some of the ship captains in Portland and throughout the state. And an interesting fact was Portland, of course, was a hub of shipping at the time. And all the ships that would come in after Titanic sank, the passengers aboard did not know that the ship had sank because the captains made the decision to keep the news secret so there wouldn't be a panic. So as they came into Portland, they were advised of this huge catastrophe. There were other little stories. There were safety features that different Mainers had invented for ships. There was a list of people from Maine thought to be aboard Titanic, and it would turn out they were not. There were names of people from Maine who had family aboard the ship, but were not Mainers themselves. There was a lot of poetry. People wrote a lot of poetry. Amateur wireless operators in the state were trying to listen for anything they could. And a reporter named Miss Eva Shorey was dispatched from the Portland Evening Express to New York to meet Carpathia. It was believed because she was female, and it was believed that all of the survivors were women and children, that she would have a much more natural rapport with these survivors. Now, as I said, there was a lot of confusion here in Maine throughout the country, and the survivor list was coming in, it was being wired in, but there were a lot of errors in it. And what it all boils down to is Maine and the world had to wait for Carpathia to arrive on Thursday, the day before Patriots' Day, to find out who had lived, who had died, and what had happened on that ship. And the Portland Evening Express wrote an editorial. The uncertainty which for 3 days has been surrounding the fate of the passengers on the doomed steamer, in view of all circumstances, has been the very refinement of torture. And then section 2, this is where you learn the stories of the people of Maine who were aboard the ship. As they came off Carpathia, there were hundreds or thousands of reporters there, and people were just giving interviews or just saying something as they came off the ship, and the story started to unfold. I'm going to tell you who these people of Maine were. In the third class section, there was a man named Alfred Verescu. He had worked in a mill in Vassalboro. He was a third class passenger, as I said. His name appeared on the passenger list, but not on the survivor list. After much digging, I cannot find much about Mr. Verescu. His story has been lost to history. In second class, there was the Reverend Charles Leonard Kirkland from Old Town. Reverend Kirkland was a Baptist minister, but he did not have a regular church. He would fill in wherever he was needed. He had married and had 9 children. 3 of them died of, I believe, pneumonia, all at the same time. His wife died of traumatic septicemia, according to the vital records. And Reverend Kirkland would marry again to a woman who was once divorced, And I believe that was a bit of a shock back in the 1900s, early 1900s. And then, and the way that his family found out he was aboard the ship was the local papers were printing the passenger lists, and they knew he would be coming back from Scotland soon. They did not know what ship he was on, so they opened up the paper, and there's their father's name. In first class, we had Dr. Alice Leader. She was a physician in Lewiston, and her husband was also a physician, and he had died about 4 years before Titanic sank. She had just retired, and she was on a trip to Europe in a party of 4 people. There was William Sloper. Mr. Sloper was from Connecticut, but his family had ties up in Greenville. And as much research as I did, I couldn't nail down a very solid connection. But there's a bed and breakfast up there, and in Greenville still, and up until recently it was called the Sloper Inn. And he had relatives that owned it at the time. It's still a bed and breakfast, and it has a Sloper room, so I know the ties were pretty strong up there. Mr. Sloper, he was 28 at the time of the sinking. He, through a series of events, the day after Carpathia arrived, the New York Sun, I believe it was a paper owned by William Randolph Hearst, ran the headline that Mr. Sloper had escaped Titanic by dressing as a woman. And Mr. Sloper would spend the rest of his life fighting that charge. He, a few weeks after Titanic sank, it became very popular to invite Titanic survivors to a luncheon or a dinner because you'd get a first-hand story from them. Mr. Sloper went to one such luncheon in his honor, and the host had arranged something on the center of the table with water and ice cubes and a little toy ship, as I guess as a joke, a very bad joke. It was Charles Melville Hayes of Portland. Mr. Hayes was president of the Grand Trunk Railroad, and Grand Trunk was credited with making what Portland was at the turn of the century in the early 1900s. He had a huge shipping facility down there, and he was described as a very honest and sober man. He didn't swear, he didn't drink. He was aboard with his wife, Clara, his daughter, Orion, and her husband, Thornton. Mr. Hayes was actually coming back to the country after a visit in Europe, and he was about to retire. This was his last year with the Grand Trunk Railroad. They had built a house on Cushing Island, a private island off Portland, and they had lived there for several years, although that's where he was going to retire to. After Titanic sank, Mr. Hayes and his son-in-law put their spouses on board a lifeboat, and at the time things were not very dire. Things were still pretty calm. And the daughter said, "We did not even think to kiss them goodbye." After Titanic sank, Charles's wife, Clara, in the lifeboats would continually call out into the darkness, "Charles Hayes, are you there?" And she would never get a response. And now there's Helen Churchill Candy of York and Edward A. Kent of Bangor. Mrs. Candy was divorced, but her ex-husband had died a few years before Titanic sank, so she took the term widow. It was more socially acceptable at the time. She was an author of several books, one titled How Women May Make a Living. She was on board Titanic coming back to America because her son had just been in an airplane accident, which was quite a novelty at the time. Not a novelty, but it was quite unusual. Airplanes had just been invented. Mr. Kent was a successful architect who was also going to retire when he got back to America after his vacation. They did not know each other before Titanic, but had mutual friends who suggested that they become acquainted as traveling companions, and they did. And basically, Mrs. Candy as Titanic was sinking, Mrs. Candy had a cameo of her mother, a piece of jewelry, and she had a flask. And Mr. Kent and this group of friends they had formed were helping Mrs. Candy to the deck, and she gave Mr. Kent the cameo and the flask, thinking that he, as a male, had a better chance of survival than she did as a female. And then there was Percival and Richard White, and they were from Brunswick. They were father and son. Percival had a hobby of taking the maiden voyage of cruise ships. He was wealthy. He was from a cotton manufacturing family. And his son Richard was a student at Bowdoin College. And Richard was due to graduate in the spring of 1912. He had worked very hard to finish his studies a semester early, and then he was going to come back for graduation. His father's reward for all that hard work was a ticket aboard Titanic with him. Mrs. White, they had two sons, Richard and Percival Jr. I was able to talk to a Lucy Salick, who's a descendant of the White family and the family historian. She always said that Richard's mother said that Richard was the good son. He was, I guess, a very studious, well-behaved child. And as it still happens today, you get a yearbook when you graduate, but those yearbooks are made up months in advance. So Richard's yearbook was made up before Titanic sank, and because his family lived very close to the college, he wasn't seen on campus as much as some of the other students. And there was a bit of an animosity between the other students and himself. And of course, the Titanic happens, and a yearbook comes out. This was not exactly flattering of poor Richard. There's a brief story about Trevor Hudson Allison. He was not from Maine or of Maine, but he had family that lived down in Old Orchard Beach. And I mention him in the story because it's so tragic. He was not a year old at the time of the sinking, and he had a sister who was 3 named Lorraine. Lorraine was the only child from first class to perish in the sinking. And what happened was the family and their servants were in 2 different quarters. The Titanic hit the iceberg, and the nanny who had Trevor pounded on the door of the parents and said, "We need to get up to the deck as quick as possible." And they told her she needed to go back to bed. And she knew better, so she took the child and went up to the deck and was immediately placed in a lifeboat. By the time the parents realized what was really happening, they came on deck, and Mrs. Allison would not leave that ship until she could find young Trevor, who was already off in a lifeboat in the Atlantic. And young Trevor would die in Old Orchard Beach at, I believe, the age of 21 from ptomaine poisoning. It's a common thing for the folks that survived Titanic. Somehow tragedies seem to find them in later years. And then we go to this, there's a group of passengers I lump under the summer colony. They were basically prominent Mount Desert Island summer people, but this is a time when it was a season down there. You showed up in May with your trunks and your household servants and everything, and you stayed until September, and there are people that shaped that area and our state. And the first, he wasn't a passenger, but I mentioned J.P. Morgan. He owned the ship, and he was a prominent Northeast Harbor summer person. And he was quite wounded by accusations made against him after Titanic sank. He was good personal friends with much of the crew and many of the passengers. And he would die almost a year to the day after Titanic sank. And then the other members of the summer colony. The first would be the Astor family. And it was John Jacob Astor and his wife Madeleine. John Jacob Astor was in his 40s and had just divorced his first wife, which was quite shocking at the time. Madeleine was 18 years old, and she was a star on the tennis courts down in Mount Desert Island. And they started dating, and rumors spread, and it was quite scandalous. They would end up getting married, and they were going to have a big ball in the Astor Mansion in New York City in January, a New Year's Eve ball, I believe. And they sent out invitations. Colonel Astor's mother was called the Queen of Society. She coined the term the 400 because her ballroom would accommodate 400 people. So if you were invited to one of her balls, you were in the cream of the crop for society. So Colonel Astor and young Madeleine plan a ball. They send out invitations, and no one accepts that invitation. So he says, let's go to Europe for the winter. When we come back, things will have died down. Well, as they're coming back from Europe aboard Titanic, Madeleine is 5 months pregnant, and she knows that this is going to ignite that same media frenzy that had happened before. I would liken them to Prince Charles and Princess Diana as far as the fame and the press scrutiny for them on them. They would spend most of their time in their cabin because Mrs. Astor, I assume, would be visibly pregnant. She was young and very fit and 5 months pregnant. So they would have people in to play bridge. One person was Helen Churchill Candy of York was invited to come play bridge with them. The other folks from Mount Desert Island, we have the Widener-Dixon family. Mr. Widener was a millionaire from making tires, I believe. He was an older man who had a younger wife. And, nope, I'm wrong, I'm thinking of the wrong person. But anyway, the Widener family, Mrs. Widener was buying her daughter's trousseau in Europe for her upcoming wedding to Mr. Dixon that summer. The Dixon name is still seen prominently in Hancock County. They contributed greatly to the hospital there, and there's the Eleanor Widener Dixon Clinic in Gouldsboro. There's the Ryerson family. Mr. Ryerson was a founder of the Mount Desert Reading Room, which was a speakeasy, I guess you would call it, back in the time of Prohibition. The wives would be on the first floor in the actual library, and the gentlemen would be upstairs having a drink or two. And there was quite a controversy about allowing women into that space. Again, this is the turn of the century, the last century. There is the Harper family. Henry Sleeper Harper was an older man, heir to the Harper Publishing family. Mr. Harper, his wife, their manservant, and 2 dogs would all get on a lifeboat with no problem. There is the Spedden family, who Daisy and Frederick Spedden, an older couple who had just one child, young Douglas, who was 6 at the time of the sinking. Douglas, they had a pretty charmed experience on Titanic. They basically came up to the deck, were put on a lifeboat. It was one of the first launched, not a problem. And they had been coming to Maine for years. About 3 years after that, fate would come and take its price from the Spedden family very dearly, a very dear price from them. They would continue to be summer in Maine, but they changed their residence. And lastly from that group is, I call him young John Thayer. Jack Thayer. Jack Thayer is what his nickname was. His father was president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and his father was an older man who had married a younger woman, and I believe Mrs. Thayer and Mrs. Astor actually got along quite well. I think they had a lot in common. Young Jack Thayer and his parents, the ship hits the iceberg, they get up on deck, and after a certain point, there's just a crush of humanity up there. Third class is making its way up. The lifeboats are almost gone. And a wave of people gets in between Jack and his parents. That's the last he sees of his father. Jack, the lifeboats are all launched. Jack would end up just jumping off the ship. And there were 2 lifeboats that couldn't be launched regularly. One floated off the ship, one was broken. Jack, along with about 30 crew members, would spend the night standing up on the bottom of this upturned lifeboat. And the men, and it was all men and one woman. They stood in two lines, and they all stood with their hands on the back of the person in front of them, just trying to keep their balance, because if they fell, it was death. And as morning came, this very calm sea started to get very rough, and this lifeboat would rock back and forth, and the air would come out from under it, and it was getting lower. So they were in unison trying to counteract each wave. And that is basically the passengers. There was, Eleanor Danforth was a passenger on Carpathia, the rescue ship. She was from Gardner, and she was a young woman who was traveling with her aunt. And on board Carpathia, when they knew they were coming to Titanic's rescue, it was still the middle of the night, it was 3 or 4 in the morning. They tried to keep the passengers in their rooms, but passengers, they seemed to hear what was going on, and Miss Danforth actually had a ringside seat to the rescue on Carpathia, which was done with a military-like precision. A rope ladder was sent down the side for people who were able-bodied. There was a chair. There was a chair that women or unable-bodied people could come up, and then there was a postage bag, an old canvas postal bag tied to a rope to put babies in, to pull them up. And they were plucked, literally plucked right out. And once they got aboard Carpathia, the first class was sent to one deck, second class to another, third to another. And then section 3, the last section, it's basically, there's a few pages on the sermons in church that Sunday. At that time, the local churches, a lot of the text of their sermons would be printed in the paper, and there's text from churches all through the state. It's quite fascinating. I should say the text is actually more from the southern half of Maine, actually. As soon as Titanic sank, some businesses in Maine exploited the disaster for advertisements. One, I believe it's New York Life, I could be wrong, but it was the local agent. Their headline might be "Women and Children First," and then you'd read, there was one that said "Women All at Sea," and as you read, it was for one of those alcohol concoctions that was supposed to rejuvenate women. There was an ad for a shirt manufacturer. The headline was quite misleading. It said, "There were many fine shirts on Titanic, and in our warehouse we have plenty too." It was odd. And a few more like that. There's a chapter on Halifax, Nova Scotia. Halifax would send out a ship, a cable laying ship, to get the bodies out of the water. And people from Maine and throughout the country sent family members up to Halifax to claim the bodies, or in some cases just try to identify the bodies. Richard White, the Bowdoin student, the president of his class, went up there to try to identify. Richard had been identified, his father Percival hadn't. He went up because Richard's older brother was too emotionally upset to go, as was the mother. And I have to say, the chapter, it's heartbreaking, it's uplifting. The Halifax people really turned out to help these folks. And then lastly, there's a prologue, and I think a lot of the most interesting stories is what happened to these people after Titanic sank and their lives went on. And let's see, I'm going to read, well, let's see, this can go two ways right here. I have marked out some passages here, just very briefly, that sort of outline the voyage. This was from Helen Churchill Candy, as she was talking about Edward Kent of Bangor. Their conversations could veer from frivolous to serious in an instant. He talked of the serious business of crossing the Atlantic on a steamer. Too serious a business for the frivolity of dressing for dinner, he felt, which is why he did not follow the custom. On deck, Candy would sometimes see Captain Edward J. Smith and the head of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay, at the railing of the ship, congratulating each other on the speed of the new ship. Kent would say they should not look so happy on a voyage across the North Atlantic. There's Mrs. Ryerson, one of the summer people, whose son, she was one of the summer people. Mr. Ismay shows her a telegram that says, telegrams have been coming in all that night, just pinpointing exactly where this 20-mile long cluster of ice is, and they were posted up in the chart room, but nobody did the math, it seemed like. And just briefly, Mrs. Ryerson asked Mr. Ismay if the proximity of the icebergs would cause the Titanic to proceed more slowly. No, we will go faster, replied Ismay, absent-mindedly putting the telegram in his pocket. And he talked about lighting more boilers, and another passenger confirmed that. Henry Sleeper Harper had been in his stateroom when the ship hit the iceberg. He thought they had run over a fishing shack. His wife tries to get him to go up on deck, and he won't because he's sick. The doctor a doctor is called and goes to investigate and says, "They tell me the trunks are floating around in the hold," said the doctor. "You may as well go on deck." Charles Hayes, the president of Grand Trunk Railroad in Portland. Between the time of the impact and the party's wait to board a lifeboat, Hayes talked to another passenger who said the ship had plenty of time left. "This boat is good for 8 hours, Hayes told his wife. "I have just been getting this from one of the best old seamen, Mr. Crossley," and he meant Mr. Crosby. Mrs. Candy, Helen Churchill Candy, that's not important. As I said, Hayes' wife and daughter do not even kiss their husbands goodbye. So the lifeboats are launched. Now, Helen Churchill Candy of York, I don't know, probably a lot of you have seen the movie Titanic, and it had Molly Brown, who was a real person, but she was not quite as boisterous as the character in the movie. Helen Churchill Candy was, though. She was the Molly Brown of her lifeboat. There seemed to be a lack of official leadership in the lifeboat. Hitchens, who took command of the lifeboat, took a steamer blanket from one of the women. He spoke dire words to his charges, reminding them that they were 1,200 miles from land with no food or water. He added that they did not even know in which direction they were headed. "We are going straight north," Mrs. Candy called to him in anger. "How do you know?" he taunted. "There is the North Star directly above our bow," she replied, which shut him up. Let's see, Dr. Leader. The ship sinks. The ship sinks with 1,500 people on it. And she says, "No one can realize the agony of those minutes when the screams and cries for succor from those who had been swept from the decks into the sea were borne to our ears by the ice-cold breeze of the night. Never so long as the good God permits me to live will I ever forget those cries." Soon the cries were silent. As the prayers and screams for help ceased, we all knew what it meant, said Dr. Leader. Death had relieved them of their agony and suffering. Two more brief ones. Jack Thayer, who was on the upturned lifeboat. Jack Thayer watched as the last two starboard forward lifeboats were loaded. A large crowd of men were pressing to enter them. He saw Ismay push his way into one of them. Men jumped from a higher deck into the boats, and officers shot at them with revolvers. It really was every man for himself, said Thayer. And then lastly, I will leave it at that. Thayer does go on to say he's setting on this upturned lifeboat at first until more people get on. Her stern gradually rose in the air, slowly, deliberately. She then seemed to rise in the air and stopped at an angle of about 60 degrees, Thayer recalled. It seemed to hold there for a time, and then with a hissing sound it shot right out of sight, with people jumping from the stern. And then there's a description of the rescue on Carpathia. It's one of the more compelling aspects of the story. I'm not going to tonight, but I normally go a little more into detail about Madeleine Astor, and this is why I mentioned the prologue. It's just a great, her story itself is a story unto itself. Colonel Astor does perish in the sinking. Mrs. Astor, at first she doesn't even think he's dead. Her father refuses to let anybody even say that to her. And of course she's pregnant, and finally she comes to terms with it, and a little time passes, and the big story is she going to come back to Mount Desert Island for the summer? And then the next big story was this huge, shocking thing that her mother has decided she's going to wear white mourning clothes instead of black, which was a huge break with convention. Newspapers across the country covered that. She has the baby. Now, in her husband, the baby doesn't get much of an inheritance in Astor terms. Colonel Astor had written up his will before he knew she was pregnant, so there was $3 million for any heir after his demise, off which they would live the interest, they wouldn't get the $3 million. But in his will, he gave Mrs. Astor, he left her most everything, the mansion in New York, a ton of stuff, $1 million, just a ton of stuff. With the caveat was, if she were to remarry, she loses everything. So, was it 4 years after Titanic sinks, she steams onto Mount Desert Island for the summer, but she has a little secret. She is gonna get married to a childhood sweetheart. She goes to the town office to get a license, and they're trying to keep it very quiet because the press is hounding her. Photographers were vying to get pictures of her young son who was born after Titanic sank. They would hang out outside the swimming club, the tennis club down on Mount Desert Island. And whenever she would come out to play tennis, crowds would just throng over there to watch. And so she's here in 1916 to get remarried, and she wants to do it secretly. And the town clerk down there says, you need, out-of-staters basically need a certain amount, 3 days, I think. And she had already had, flowers were coming in, the caterers, secret guests and everything for a small ceremony. Anyway, at the end, she does get the license and the secret's out. So they go to it's St. Saviour's Church, Episcopal Church in the center of Bar Harbor, which is beautiful. And the wedding party comes in, and there's a huge crowd. Somebody even has a moving picture camera, which was quite new for the time. The ceremony goes on, and then a few of the attendants come out the front door, so the crowd's ready. They're going to see Mrs. Astor, who has forfeited the Astor fortune for love. And they're ready. The two attendants come out, and the rest of Mrs. Astor, who's now Mrs. William Dick, she and her husband go out the back door of St. Saviour's, hop into a car, and they go, there's little Kennebec Street. I used to park in that parking lot, and it just sneaks down to Cottage Street, and zoom, you can head to Ellsworth, and that's what they did, and they kind of duped everybody. But her life goes on to be very sad, and she dies in her early 40s, actually, and that little part of the story is fun, but it actually gets tragic after that. And that's pretty much all I have to say. I will say I'm going to be selling books here if anybody wants to buy one, but if you don't, I won't give you the stink eye. $15.95, but I sell them for $15 at these events. And I take checks, cash, and I'm very proud of this book. There's 10 years of research in this book. And it's crammed full with details and quotes. And nothing in here is fabricated, because at the time this happened, newspaper was king. It was just about the only medium other than word of mouth. So there is so much printed. The United States Senate had a 2-month inquiry into the matter. They had another inquiry in London, and so there's just a wealth of information. So I've not just laid out facts, I've tried to knit them together into something that is interesting and that will preserve Maine history. And that concludes my talk. If there are any questions, I'm happy to ask them. But I do want to thank everybody for being here tonight. Time is short, and I really appreciate that everybody took some time to listen to me talk about my books.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I heard you were in the Navy, but what got you interested in doing this? I mean, what was the motivator?
I have a brother, and I was in a bookstore looking for a Maine history book for him, and I thought, now wouldn't it be interesting if there was a Maine history book that involved Titanic, which was more my interest. And I did some preliminary research, and I found some of these stories here. And much like the third-class passenger, where there's no information, history gets lost to time. And these stories were too interesting. These people went through too much to lose their stories to time. And I wanted to preserve them, and that's what I did, and that was my motivation.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
So I missed the beginning. Did you say how many Mainers were on the ship?
There were about, the way I say it is, there were about 14 parties on board.
Oh, yeah.
Some were a party of two, some were larger parties with servants and such. And I sometimes will say people from Maine. What I mean to say is people of Maine. Some had lived here all their lives, some not, but we're a big diverse state, and these are the stories. So, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Could you talk a little bit about the problems with the ship?
Oh boy, I could spend all night doing that, but I won't. The watertight doors weren't high enough. The interesting thing with Titanic, so many things went wrong, and if any one of them had gone right, I wouldn't be here today, we wouldn't be here today. The iceberg warnings were coming in left and right. They were headed right for this, like I said, 20-mile long pack of ice. When Titanic sank and the sun came up the next morning, these lifeboats were surrounded by these beautiful icebergs, but lots of them and huge. And one person commented, it's not a matter of that they sank, it's that they survived as long as they did without hitting that iceberg. Just several problems like that. There was no alarm system on the ship, but because there were not enough lifeboats, I think that was a bit of a blessing, because you didn't want the panic to set in. You wanted to prevent the panic as long as you could. And once the panic hit, it hit. And the people that escaped from at the beginning, they say, oh, everything was very calm and wonderful. But then you get Jack Thayer and some of the people that survived at the very end, and their stories are very different. It was a comedy of errors, I think is safe to say. All right, if nobody else has any questions, again, thank you for being here, everybody.
Help yourself to some snacks.